Before we officially start, I'd like to lay down some housekeeping rules. All speakers are requested to keep their microphones off when they're not speaking to ensure good audio quality for everyone. Speakers are also encouraged to switch on their cameras, especially when they're speaking, if the network allows to do that without any disruptions. The seminar will be recorded and the video will be posted online. You're welcome to revisit the discussion later and feel free to share it with your network as well. We also invite questions from our audience and colleagues at the end or as the session goes. Please feel free to write them in the chat box or in the QA box on the right side. While you're writing your questions, please also make sure you're naming the person who the question is directed towards so that we can save time. With that being said, let's officially start the webinar. I'm going to give a bit of a background before we dive into the conversation. So the World Bank recently commissioned 2 reports on the potential of variable renewable energy in Pakistan. The first report came out in November 2020 and focused on planning aspects and the optimal energy mix for Pakistan. The report demonstrated that the Pakistani grid in its current state could take in a penetration of at least 30% of solar and wind energy. This was followed by the VRE locational study, which came out earlier this year in February and focused mostly on locational aspects of Pakistan's solar and wind energy resource potential. So while both reports have established an undisputed case for increased uptake of renewable energy in Pakistan's power sector, we actually see very little translation of this into concrete action. On the one hand, we have policies like the Alternate Renewable Energy 2019 policy that sets a 30% target for RE integration into the generation mix by 2030. Yet at the same time, we have the recent version of the IGCP document that limits implementation of this target to only 10%. So with today's discussion, we're hoping to probe further into this disconnect that exists between power generation policies and planning processes. And at the same time, we're also looking forward to having a conversation about what a way forward from all of this could look like for Pakistan. So our first speaker today is going to be Mr. Oliver Knight, who's working as a senior energy specialist at the World Bank. He has over 15 years of experience in international development and UK domestic policy issues, and has been leading the Sindh Solar Energy Project and a number of related technical assistance projects on renewable energy development in Pakistan. Oliver is going to be giving us a presentation on the key findings of both the reports. After that, we'll move on towards a panel discussion on different aspects of these reports and how the power policy and planning process could incorporate the outcomes laid out by these documents. So Oliver, thank you very much for joining us today. Please go ahead with your presentation.
Thank you very much for inviting me. And you had the suit version of me, and now you have the slightly more casual version of me because you happened to catch me on leave, but very happy to be here. And I also, just to note, I just heard from my colleague Anjum Ahmad, who is Senior Energy Specialist in the Islamabad office, and he's also joined, and we've done all of this work, both of us co-lead this work on renewable energy together. So the presentation today, as you described, is going to cover 2 reports that have already published, and we've got 2 additional ones on the way. So if you just go to the next slide. So thank you very much. So the first report, as you just described, was the VRE integration and planning study. This was a very substantial piece of work. It actually took around 2 years to get from beginning to end. In particular, there was a lot of discussion and working with NTDC, who was the lead on the government side, and a lot of stakeholder engagement. So we had, I think, 3 or 4 workshops, and then written comments, etc. So it really brought in the views of both federal and provincial agencies, and therefore that explains partly why it was actually quite a long process. But we got it out and published on the World Bank website in November 2020. And I should say at this point, actually, VRE, for those that may not have come across this term, stands for variable renewable energy. And it's a term that we use mainly to describe solar and wind, which are variable in nature. And of course, renewable energy as a broader term would include other resources, biogas, hydro, etc. But for the purposes of this presentation and the work we've done, we've been very much focusing on solar and wind, which have, of course, very large potential in Pakistan, considering the resources. The second study picked up and actually overlapped with the first study, was done by different consultants, but really the question we wanted to answer there is, okay, if Pakistan has a certain amount of renewable energy that it should be looking to develop, where should that be going? Where are the optimal places for that, taking account of all the different factors? So those two are the ones I'm going to give very, very high level summary of today, because we don't have huge amounts of time, but of course, a lot of detail in both of those two reports. They're very extensive, they have annexes. So if people are looking for a masterclass on the current situation and the modeling that was carried out, it's obviously worth going and reading those reports in full. Just to mention, we're working on 2 additional studies, the Renewable Energy Competitive Bidding Study. This has actually been, the lead for this has been Alternative Energy Development Board, AEDB, and we're just finalizing that as we speak, and it's going through a final review phase right now. So we hope that will come out soon. And that is really to help the government operationalize or think through the options for operationalizing competitive bidding in Pakistan. And then the final study that we mentioned the most recently is a study on distributed energy solutions, really to scope out all the different possibilities for distributed energy, that's solar, rooftop solar, looking at battery storage, looking at energy efficiency retrofits, solar tube wells, mini grids, these kinds of technologies. So that's going to be quite exciting, and that will come out slightly later this year. Next slide, please. So just to give you some headlines on the VRE integration and planning study. Next slide. The high level summary of this is that the study basically took a detailed and the latest modeling software, which is a commercial software called Plexus, and it essentially models the system on an hourly basis. So it's a big improvement on what was being done previously. And it looks at all the different resources, it looks at their costs, it also looks at the system's ability to integrate them and transmit the power. So it's essentially a very holistic modeling software. So we put all the data into that, and the data was provided by NTDC, and in fact, they have ended up utilizing this same software for the IGCE. And so you can essentially see this as a precursor to work they've been doing more recently. Now, bearing in mind, of course, that the situation since the work we carried out has changed a bit. And of course, there's been a pandemic that was hit us after the modeling work was completed. And so there have been quite substantial reductions in the expected demand, increase in demand over up to 2030. So that does need to be taken into account. So just bear that in mind when you look at these results. But still, one would obviously expect the system to come back from that for demand growth to continue. And so therefore, we really, we feel that the results are quite robust. So the key headline here is that the high share of VRE is optimal for the Pakistan power sector. And according to the modeling, that the optimal share would be around 30% by 2030. And if you add that to the hydropower, that's how you get to the government stated target for 6% renewable energy. So when you combine the VRE with hydro, adding that would also be competitive. It would save money, and it would be the least cost expansion. In fact, if you go out, that actually would keep going. So you would even end up with higher shares than 30%, ideally by 2030, and certainly beyond that. That implies adding a quite substantial amount of VRE every year. Now, of course, maybe in the short run, that result may have changed, but certainly one needs to be adding quite substantial amounts up to 2030. Next slide, please. So the second finding we have here is that adding VRE leads to lower system costs and other benefits for the Pakistan power sector. So a lot of people in the past, I think, have assumed that when you add solar and wind, because you've got the variability, you actually increase the cost to the system of having to manage those. Now, I guess under a price structure where VRE, solar and wind were relatively expensive compared to other sources of power, and you've got this additional integration cost, then of course you could see that there would be limits to how much you'd want to put on. But solar and wind, the assumption now is that solar and wind is essentially the least cost form of generation. It's essentially cheaper than any other resource, and we certainly expect that to be the case once competitive bidding is brought in. And you should be able to see the kind of prices you see in India and in the Middle East and other places. And so with that in mind, the system costs do not outweigh those cost benefits. And this holds true even in a low demand environment. So we actually, when we were carrying out the study, and I don't think we had a pandemic in mind, but we certainly anticipated that there could be lower demand growth than the central case in the model. And these findings did hold true even in that lower demand case. So I think that's important to recognize from where we are today. Next slide, please. The third finding, and I think this is probably pretty intuitive, and certainly I think, recognizing some of the recent events in Pakistan on supply and difficulties getting hold of supply sometimes, and that's certainly been the case looking over a longish period of time when you're talking about fossil fuels, particularly imported fossil fuels. VRE will allow for more diversified and domestic energy mix. And I think it's important to recognize that there are two different points there. One is you get diversification just by having 30% from two additional sources of power. So you would have a large amount of hydro, you then have a large amount of solar, and you have a large amount of wind. That gives you diversity. But also, these are domestic resources. So you're not reliant on imports, you're not reliant on the ports being opened or geopolitical events being in one's favor. And of course, there's a mitigation on price risk as well. No one, in the long run, no one knows what's going to happen to the price of imported gas, for example, whereas for renewable energy, the price is fixed at the point at which the project is bid out. So these are very critical things to bear in mind. And the other thing here is that the other finding, the third bullet point here, is that VRE and hydropower actually complement each other very, very well. If you look across World Bank client countries, it's those countries that have large hydropower potential where they can really make the most of VRE, because the hydro can be operated slightly will be different to how the hydro has acted in the past. Next slide, please. So the fourth finding here is that adding this additional capacity from VRE means that actually, looking from where the country stands now, additional capacity from domestic and imported coal is not competitive when compared against that solar and wind. And this, of course, is making some assumptions because we haven't had these prices that we would expect to get from competitive bidding. But average price for solar and wind, the finding of the modeling that domestic and imported coal is no longer competitive. Certainly, new projects that might be considered, and this is before considering environmental impacts. So we all know that coal has air pollution impacts. It uses a lot of water for cooling, and then of course there's the global greenhouse gas emission impact. And Pakistan has obviously made some pledges, international pledges there as well. But even just looking at some of the local acts, they could be quite significant, particularly in a water scarce parts of the country. And so, and this finding we have here is robust, even without considering those environmental impacts. So I think that's quite a strong point to bear in mind, considering some of the current conversations on new build coal. Next slide, please. All right, next slide. Great, thank you. This is the final one on this report, which is that to get there, to do this VRE expansion, there need to be quite significant investments in the grid infrastructure and in improved operations. this is actually something one would want to do regardless. So these are actually investments that Pakistan, the power sector would benefit from anyway, such as introduction of SCADA 3, better forecasting of solar and wind, and these just general upgrades to the grid infrastructure. The World Bank actually, Anjem is a co-lead on a project the World Bank has with NTDC for these kinds of upgrades to the existing transmission network, and more of that will very likely be needed going out into the future. You're just going to have to continue to strengthen the network and also expand the network. And then, of course, there are these operational considerations. And right now, the situation with solar and wind is that there really is very limited forecasting. And so the grid operator, MPCC, actually quite struggles with how to predict and manage the wind in particular that is coming onto the system, because they don't have any foresight as to when that might drop off or when it might come back on. So this is something that is a relatively easy and cheap and quick win, and it's something that we believe needs to happen soon. So next slide, we're moving on to the locational study. Next slide, please. Just a quick introduction to how this was carried out. So there were two steps, well, several steps a bit. The first one here is we started with a very physical multi-criteria analysis. So essentially, this takes in lots of different maps of Pakistan, looking at firstly the wind resource, the solar resource, population centers, topography, national protected areas, road network, etc., to try and eliminate areas of the country where you would not want to build solar or wind. So of course you don't want to do wind where there's no wind resource. You don't want to do solar where you've got very steep slopes or mountains, and you ideally also want to be close to existing transmission network. You want to be close to a road. You want to be away from population centers. So these are all the considerations, just to kind of narrow down a very large territory, of course, it's a very large country, but to try and focus it down onto parts of the country where it would be optimal to build solar and wind. Next slide. This second step then was to look at the actual grid, the existing grid network, and look at where those substations are and what the congestion is, or what the supply situation is, substation by substation. And this is actually something that is a bit harder to do. One needs real data from the transmission operator. Again, this study was done very closely with NTDC, so it was provided. But the point here is to, particularly for solar, is to try and find bits of the grid, in particular remote, far-flung substations that actually would benefit from solar. This is not a situation necessarily where adding renewable energy needs to stress the system. Actually, putting solar on a remote substation or near a remote substation that's underutilized actually helps to balance and improve voltage levels. It helps to generate more power out where it's actually being used. And solar, of course, as we know, is generated in the daytime. So this can actually be, this is where one starts. This is like the low-hanging fruit. And so this was one of the inputs into this study. Next slide, please. So the results were, there's some very interesting high-level results, very much summarized by this map, which shows province by province the amount of capacity or the amount of generation one would be looking to do across two different timelines, near term, essentially to meet a 20% target by 2025, which was the government's target, and then a 30% target by 2030. And you can see very aggressive need for building out PV and wind. You've got the totals there, and then you've also got what that breaks down to by province. And yeah, I think you can see quite quickly from these figures that every province actually is important here. And I think it's an important message out of this report that there is something for every province here. Obviously, Balochistan and Sindh have a lot of wind resource. KP is more limited for solar and wind, but KP has a lot of small hydro and large hydro. Punjab is certainly a big area for solar. So when you balance it out, there is something in here for every province. but also I think a very strong message for province like Balochistan, where there is real potential to dramatically increase local generation in that province and actually export that to the rest of the country and have renewable energy be a generator of economic development and jobs. And of course, in Balochistan, that's a key consideration, also in parts of Sindh as well. So this is, I think, a strong message here that there is potential in every province, but of course, different provinces have different roles to play here, particularly when it comes to solar and or wind. Please. So this is the last slide here, but the main findings. So the 20% target, which is quite a lot of capacity, can be largely achieved by the low-hanging fruit, essentially by putting spare capacity at existing substations, and a lot of that is solar. And so there's not actually an immediate need for grid upgrades. Now, of course, if demand growth is slower, that finding could hold maybe even up to a lot of 2030 as well. But essentially, there's a lot of infilling of generation that can be done. So putting solar at the end of the grid in small parcels, and that will actually need a different type of competitive bidding to doing large VRE parks. So this is the second point here, to actually get to larger capacities, in particular to get to the 30% VRE target, there will need to be big new investments. In particular, we believe there'll need to be a high voltage DC transmission line to Balochistan, probably covering around 1,000 kilometers, to open up 6+ gigawatts of solar and wind in Balochistan. And this leads to the final recommendation, which is that particularly when you're looking at these RE parks, there needs to be consideration of RE hubs. That would be solar and wind being developed in the same location. And there are several locations that have been identified in the report where that can occur. Bahawalpur, Jampir, Chagi, etc. And these will be areas where you can develop a large amount of solar and wind in one place, have dedicated transmission, and the public sector, the government, particularly the provincial governments, will play a role in helping to develop those sites, get them ready for then the private sector to come in and build the actual power plants. So with that, the final slide is just my details. Thank you very much for listening, and I'm happy to answer questions, or just I'll stay along for the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation, Oliver. I think it was a great overview of the two reports, and you've demonstrated quite well why we need to have a higher integration of renewable energy, not just from an economic perspective, but also from an energy security perspective. So thank you for that. And we're also very keen to have the distributed generation study and the auction study come out by the World Bank. We're really looking forward to those as well. Now we're going to move on towards our panel discussion. We have an excellent lineup of speakers that are going to come in and give their views. The panel discussion is going to be moderated by Mustafa Amjad. So Mustafa, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ania. First of all, assalamu alaikum and a very warm welcome to all of you. Again, thank you, Oliver, for that kind summary and introduction to the VRE reports. Again, these reports are rich in content, and there's a lot to unpack in these. But these summaries serve as a good platform for us to move our discussion further. What we want today, our key focus for today, is moving on from these reports and understanding the challenges, the opportunities. What are some of the gaps that have been identified in the report, and how does the energy sector in Pakistan, be it the private sector, be it moving towards auctions and CTPCM, be it the distributed generation aspect, how does that all play out in Pakistan, and what are some of the challenges, opportunities for the energy sector with regards to that. So first of all, I would like to invite Mr. Shehbaz Ahmed, who is currently working as the Manager Power System Planning with National Transmission and Dispatch Company. Thank you, Shehbaz, for joining us. Shehbaz, NTDC was an integral part of both the World Bank VRE integration and planning study, as well as they also published the recent iteration of the IGCEP. So as proponents of renewable energy, what we see is that there's a marked difference between the ratio of renewable energy integration in both these two reports. Again, both these reports, the World Bank reports and the IGCP, were modeled through Plexos. Both were working towards a low-cost model. So why do you think there is this discrepancy with regards to renewable energy integration? And what are the major hurdles to achieving a 30% penetration of renewable energy in the generation mix by 2030 with regards to particularly transmission and dispatch?
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Actually, yes, we have prepared the latest version of IGCEP, which is IGCEP 2021-30. So in this report, the targets of ARE as 25% in 2020 and 30% in 2030, those are not adhered. Actually, when the previous version of IGCEP was prepared, that was IGCEP 2047, these targets were implemented. Now, when we studied this ARE policy, in this policy, there are two places. And in the article 1.2, it is written that the ARE will be included as per least cost. And in the article number 1.4.1, it is written that at least 25% in 2020, at least 20% in 2025 and 30% in 2030, ARE, renewable energy, will be added. And then in addition to this, government has approved a national electricity policy. So according to this policy, they are going to amend this statement that hydro should also be considered as renewable energy, and those should be included in these targets. That's why in the revision, in the updation process in IGCEP 2021, we have included hydropower plants as also renewable energy. So if we look at the figures, recently hydro is 29% in our system, in Pakistan power system. Wind is 3% and solar is 1%. So already this total comes up to be 34%. So by adding further power plants when we reach in 2025, so addition of hydro, wind and solar, the total comes out to be 46% of the installed capacity. And in 2030, the sum of these hydros, wind and solar, it is 57% of the total capacity, where total capacity is 53,000 megawatt. And the sum of these three categories is 30,000 megawatts. So which is around 57-58%. So that's why including hydro has changed the scenario that the sum of wind and solar is not getting according to these values, 30% and 20%. So this is the difference, because previously you are right that for the preparation of these two reports, VRE study and other the reports prepared by World Bank, the data was shared by NTDC, and the same data was used by us for the preparation of IGCEP 2047. So there is no hurdle. Actually, this is a policy statement, policy document, which we have to follow as being a federal entity. So this is the difference, that hydro is considered as renewable energy in these targets.
Gee, thank you, Shahbaz. So the second part of our question perhaps was, why do we see this shift? So why is VRE, as in wind and solar energy, not getting its due share with regards to, are there some transmission and dispatch issues? Is it not least cost for Pakistan? Do we feel like hydro is better suited to Pakistan compared to wind and solar? And as per the current iteration of the ARE policy, hydro is not included as a part of the 30% target. So we have seen that the Prime Minister has also issued the 60% by 2030 target in international forums, where 30% is meant to be hydro and 30% is meant to be wind and solar. So how do you, as NTDC, take those comments and take this particular issue with regards to wind and solar into planning considerations?
Yes, as I told you, the total share of these three, wind, solar and hydro, is around 58% in 2030. So as Prime Minister talks about 60%, that is okay, but you are saying that as a separate, wind and solar should be 30%, that is not followed. As per the question of least cost, the reason is that most of the hydropower plants, they are already committed under some categories. some coal power plants, and some other RLNG power plants. So our criteria is that for committed power plants, which are either G2G or they fall under strategic or they are already their financial close has been achieved. So such projects actually they don't go through optimization process, and they are commissioned as per their CODs. So the remaining portion which has to be fed by the other candidate power plants, that is in competition. So here the cushion for the candidate power plants was very much limited because demand is already decreased due to COVID, and committed power plants were too much that the candidate power plants could not be selected at a higher side. So wind and solar power plants, according to IGCEP 2021, these are added as around 4,000 megawatt, which is due to the displacement of some expensive thermal power plants. So we can say that due to the bigger volume of committed power plants, it could not be selected as per least cost criteria. Thank you.
Thank you, Shahbaz sir. Please, if you could stay around for the Q&A session, we do have a few questions, but those will be again entertained at the end. So we'd like to move on to our next speaker, next panelist. We are joined by Mr. Amin Lakhani. Mr. Amin Lakhani was the director of clean energy projects on the USAID-funded Sustainable Energy for Pakistan project. Being the team lead on this project, he supported Alternative Energy Development Board (AEDB) to achieve the financial closing of 12 wind and 4 solar powered projects totaling 860 megawatts, thereby mobilizing an investment of over $922 million in Pakistan. He was also the team lead for SCP Tetra Tech as well as local and foreign advisory firms, which prepared Pakistan's first competitive procurement framework for renewable energy in cooperation with AEDB. So thank you very much, Lakhani sir, for joining us today. We do understand that it's very early in the United States for you, so thank you for taking out the time for this. Lakhani sir, if you could, again, you wanted to provide a critique of the latest version of the IGCEP. So what we want from your end is, how do you think, what are some recommendations and suggestions on how we can probably improve this IGCEP document? And also please comment on why it doesn't really meet the VRE targets set forth by the ERE 2019 policy, and perhaps some suggestions for future iterations on how this can be achieved in Pakistan. Thank you, sir.
Well, thank you very much, Mustafa, and I'll do my best. I think, and thank you to the Renewable Energy Coalition for giving me an opportunity to share my thoughts. And assalamu alaikum, ladies and gentlemen. At CEP, I had the pleasure of reviewing and commenting on IGCEP 2020 last year in my capacity as Director Clean Energy. Now I'm commenting on IGCEP 2021 as an independent observer of the Pakistan power sector. I will make 4 suggestions. I actually had 5, but because of the timing constraints, I put it down to 4. If there's more time, then we can perhaps talk about them. I'll make 4 suggestions to improve the document, but would like to begin with an overarching observation on the report. And I believe my remarks will also answer the question posed by the moderator. I think it'll be covered. The IGCEP 2021 report did not provide a single scenario based on an unconstrained optimization of a least cost generation plan. However, in IGCEP 2020, 12 scenarios were presented, including 2 scenarios that could be considered as unconstrained. In IGCEP 2021, 82% of the capacity was designated as committed projects. And as a result, only 12% of the capacity was available for least cost optimization. This may be the reason why the projections of the plan could not meet the ARE 2019 policy targets of 20% by 2025 and 30% by 2030. My fundamental criticism is, or critique is, that it is very difficult to have an informed discussion on the path forward without the comparison of the proposed base case with numerous relevant scenarios, including the unconstrained options. So that in a way partly answers some of the questions you had. Before I present my suggestions, I would like to state that I sincerely appreciate the efforts made by NTDC and in producing IGCEP 2020 and now 2021. NTDC mentioned in their report that, and I actually had the page number, but I don't have it right. There is no room bigger than the room for improvement. These are exact quotes. It is in that spirit that I propose the following suggestions for improving IGCEP 2021. My first recommendation is, please revise the definition of committed projects in the private sector to projects that have achieved financial closing. The current standard of giving projects with an LOS in category 1 and projects with a tariff determination in category 2 is very loose. There is no assurance that a project with an LOS or a tariff determination will achieve financial closing in the near term. For example, 15 bagasse projects with a total capacity of 491 megawatts with LOSs were included as committed projects in 2021, 2020, and perhaps even 2019. But there has been no progress on these projects for the past 3 years. These projects structurally, remember, usurp space in the precious supply queue and deny an opportunity to other wind and solar project developers to provide capacity on a competitive basis at a lower cost and much lower emissions. A similar observation can be made for some projects in category 2. Projects in categories 1 and 2 can continue to retain their development rights as per the CCOE decision. And when they achieve a financial closing, they should be incorporated in the IGCEP in the next iteration. So that is really the first major recommendation. There's also a parallel recommendation that will come eventually after I've done some enough reading and thinking on the public sector project sides and on the G2G side. And I can assure you that the major part of the issues or problem or the savings are going to be on the public sector projects. My second recommendation is please reduce the entry size of mega projects into smaller digestible capacities to facilitate least cost optimization. For example, the 4,500 megawatt Diamar Basha Dam has a scheduled COD, commercial operation date, of 2028-29. That is fiscal 2029, as per IGCEP 2021. It is inconceivable that Pakistan has the technical construction capability, the power evacuation capability, the financing capability, the consumer demand capability to bring online 4,500 megawatts of hydro capacity in 7 years. As a comparison, it took over 10 years to build the 969 megawatt Neelam Jhelum project. Why do we accept such unachievable assumptions, or why do we input such unachievable assumptions in the analysis and put our future planning at risk? Super mega projects in Pakistan and even overseas are not built overnight. They are built in stages. Tarbela Dam, which was started over three decades ago, is now on its 5th expansion. For example, Diamar Basha with 4,500 megawatts consists of 12 units of 375 megawatts each. If it is offered as 6 separate candidate packages of 750 megawatts, on an unconstrained basis, it is likely to be incorporated into the system at the most optimal time and least cost, say over a 20 or 30-year period. Therefore, it is recommended that mega projects, regardless of fuels or technology, be offered in relatively smaller, investable, digestible blocks. Another thing to mention, which I will expand on in a later article or something, is that you have to make sure when you put this, do the budgeting for the hydropower projects, that the cost related, not related to the power generation portion, like flood control or irrigation or some kind of a storage, is not lumped into the costs of power generation. Because when you do that, you make the levelized cost of electricity very high, and then the Plexo system is unable to pick that up. And then we complain, project, it did not come in this whole optimization process. My third recommendation is to use the RLNG price as the fuel cost for all natural gas-fired plants, whether existing, committed, or candidate projects for optimization purposes. This will be quite, knock on wood, but revolutionary and new to some of you. Domestic gas in Pakistan is priced at different amounts depending on when and where it was discovered. And it is significantly lower than the price of imported RLNG, which is indexed to crude oil prices. However, since Pakistan is now both a major gas producer and RLNG importer, any increase or decrease in consumption results in an increase or decrease in RLNG imports. In other words, regardless of the actual lower administered price, remember the word administered price for domestic gas, the international RLNG price is the true replacement cost of all gas consumed in Pakistan and should be used for system optimization calculations. The use of the true shadow price will further squeeze out inefficient gas generation plants in the merit order and make room for more cost-effective alternatives like wind, solar, storage, hydro, and high-efficiency combined cycle units. My fourth recommendation is to use market-based CapEx cost reduction rates for wind and solar equipment. The CapEx cost for wind and solar equipment are declining rapidly and will continue to do so, particularly for solar equipment. IGCP 2021 has used CapEx reduction rates of 1% and 3.6% in CapEx costs for wind and solar equipment, respectively, for the period 2021 to 2030. I believe those estimates are highly conservative. Based on our review of IRENA material, our estimates show a historical reduction rate of 3.6% and 15.8% for wind and solar CapEx, respectively, for the period 2010 to 2019. I believe that a future reduction rate of 50%, that is half of the previous 10-year reduction rate, would be a more realistic and conservative rate to use. Based on that assumption, the CapEx reduction rates should be, or should tested to be in a sensitivity analysis, 1.8% and 7.9% for wind and solar, respectively. Such a change will have a positive impact in increasing the proportion of wind and solar generation in the supply mix and also reduce the average system cost. I have read the IGCP 2021 report, all 178 pages twice. I could read it the third, fourth, and fifth time and come up with even more recommendations. The point I'm trying to make is that IGCP development is an iterative process, and Pakistan is at the beginning of its IGCP optimization journey. So let us work together and support the journey. Thank you for listening to me, and I'll be happy to answer any questions at the appropriate time.
Thank you so much, Lakhani Saab. Thank you for your inputs and for the recommendations. Again, we'll be looking forward to, again, reading more about these recommendations and further recommendations as well, because as you mentioned, this is the starting point and there is a long way to go for us with regards to planning both for generation and transmission as well. So thank you for your inputs. The next speaker that we have on the panel is Mr. Zishan Ishfaq. Zishan Ishfaq is a member of the Pakistan Renewable Energy Coalition as well. He has been a part of the World Wind Energy Association for the previous 6 years and is currently working as the managing director in Pakistan for the Sovitech Group, one of the world's largest solar and wind power developers. So thank you, Zishan, for taking the time out for this. Zishan, a question from you would be, again, we want some private sector opinions on the IGCP report, on the VRE reports as well. So keeping in mind the output of the VRE locational study, how does the private sector view the recommendations laid out in the document, particularly with regards to renewable energy auctions and the CTBCM? So how does the private sector view these recommendations, and what are some of the challenges in incorporating these suggestions?
Thank you very much, Mustafa, for having me. Hi, everyone, and I'm also thankful to organizers, for holding this webinar on such an important subject. So, moving back to your question, I will answer it in a couple of parts. But before doing that, I would like to appreciate the work that the World Bank has done over the past few years, and these two studies that have already been published are quite remarkable, and now we are looking forward to the studies on renewable energy auctions and also on the distributed generation. But I wish it would have been better if the private sector were involved in the consultation process of finalizing this competitive bidding study. So moving on towards, moving on towards your question, Mustafa, I will be, answering it in a couple of parts. The first one is the site development itself, and the second one is creation of markets and looking beyond the price component while holding renewable energy auctions. So, when we look at the recommendations of this locational study, we see the World Bank study recommending, tendering out the sites. And, as all of you know that renewable energy sources are quite site and location sensitive. If we are looking at bigger clusters, various locations within those clusters, will have different resource availability, and particularly if we talk about wind power, this location stuff becomes even more important. So, in order to, take this stuff further, it would be important to highlight the cases of Zambia and South Africa. I'll be discussing shortly about the findings of a study that, talks about the government-led site development in Zambia and compares it with the developer-led site development in South Africa. So despite contrary intentions, site-specific risks have been perceived as the highest overall project risks in government-led site selection process in Zambia. Especially site-specific risks were driven by several severe technical issues such as geotechnical, grid, and solar irradiation uncertainties. And in Zambia, Zambia's first auction round, site selection issues on the project side led to additional development work after project award. Sorry, my screen is blanking. I don't know why. Therefore, I'm moving the lid up and down. Sorry for that. And if we talk about South Africa in contrast, the developer-led site selection process, site-specific risks have been reported to be important, but less pronounced compared to the case of Zambia. And they were more evenly distributed among technical, economic, legal, permitting, and social risk factors. If we talk about Pakistan, we are no longer a nascent renewable energy market. We have already entered the early maturity phase, and the provincial governments have limited financial and human resources. Therefore, it would be better to look at hybrid solutions whereby the government defines a grid area for the auction, and bidders select and develop a site. I believe that this could be a better option. And since auctions can be costly, it is important to mobilize the capital from the private sector. And certain pre-qualification requirements can be announced, which will actually deter speculative bidding. And these pre-qualification requirements can include preliminary grid access, environmental permitting and impact assessments, land use rights, and certain other financial qualifications. And now moving to the second part of my answer, which is related to creating markets instead of just focusing on the cost component of renewable energy auctions. It is important because in Pakistan, renewable energy sources are already the most competitive source of new power generation in the country. And we must look beyond the price component. Of course, the price should remain the main determinant in awarding renewable energy projects in the upcoming auction, but we must focus on socio-economic development, foreign investment, local value creation, industrialization, and more importantly, diversity of actors and locations. And in my opinion, instead of following the auction design of some Middle Eastern countries, it would be better to look at some Latin American markets where various auction designs were followed, but there was one commonality that was the creation of markets and maximizing diversity of actors in the auctions process. And if we look at the auctions in those markets, of the total renewable energy projects that were awarded in 6 Latin American countries between 2015 to June 2019, and these countries are Brazil, Mexico, Chile, Argentina, Peru, and Jamaica. We see that vast majority of the projects awarded were less than 40 megawatt in size, and of the total projects, around 537 projects were of less than 40 megawatt size, and 99 projects were of of a size between 40 to 100 megawatt, and only 29 projects were in the range of 100 to 160 megawatt, and even lesser 22 projects were with more than 160 megawatt size. It is important to mention here that smaller project sizes and diversity of market participants did not mean that the prices didn't go down in those renewable energy markets. In the case of Brazil, the prices declined by around the average awarded tariff decrease was around 55% from 2015 to 2019. And in the case of Chile, in just 2 years from 2015 to 2017, the reduction was around 59%. In Mexico, in 2 years, the reduction was 27%. And in Argentina, it was around 22%. So, in the case of Pakistan, our government needs to decide whether it wants to control the market or create one. Thank you. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer.
Thank you so much, Zishan. Again, I would request all the panelists to please keep their intervention, limit their intervention to 7 minutes. We do have a few other interventions planned as well. So thank you, Zishan, for bringing on board the opinion of the private sector as well, particularly with regards to auction designs, again, which is something that the World Bank is supporting AEDB with regards to development of CTBCM markets as well. So next up, I would like to request Mr. Syed Akil Hussain Jafri, who is working as the Director Policy at AEDB. Mr. Jafri has served AEDB for more than 16 years. His specialties include power policy, project coordination, project appraisal, project implementation, government liaison, and renewable energy. So thank you for joining us today, Mr. Jafri. Jafri Saab, the question that we have for you is, when it comes to variable renewable energy, we see a lot of institutional barriers to its uptake. Private investors feel that solar and wind energy projects are being discriminated unfairly when they're made to participate in competitive bidding, while other forms of energy are being awarded tariffs on cost-plus basis. Even the RFP document that was supposed to initiate the bidding process is facing delays. What are AEDB's views on addressing these concerns, and how will AEDB facilitate the 104 Category 3 projects that have been impacted by these delays?
Thank you, Mustafa. Thank you for inviting me to this webinar. I would like to apprise that Mr. Shahjahan Mirza was supposed to attend this webinar, but due to his other engagements, he couldn't make it. So I've been asked to represent him and AEDB in this webinar. Well, as your question relates to the future prospects and especially the fate of the 104 projects in Category 3. As mentioned earlier by the speakers, that government has a new policy in place which sets a target of 20% by 25 and 30% by 35. But at the same time, the policy, which unfortunately or fortunately is a very watertight policy, that also states that all the developments will be based on the outputs of IGCEP. And unfortunately, we've been waiting for the finalization and of the IGCEP and its approval by NEPRA. Only then we would be able to implement the policy in its true spirit, because there is a whole structure laid down in the policy, which starts from the IGCEP being approved by NEPRA, and then the steering committee has to make the procurement plan of RE, which will be a mix of projects on bidding plus projects on new technologies, which will be on cost plus mode. So the policy itself allows cost plus mode for some new technologies, but for the mature technologies like in wind and solar, it is primarily going to be the bidding process. You mentioned in your comment that some of the projects have concerns that other technology, there's a discrimination being done since other technologies, especially the conventional power projects, are being allowed on cost plus. whereas renewables have been linked with the IGCEP outputs and on bidding basis. That is truly not the case, because speaking on behalf of PPIB, I can say that in the last 4 years, PPIB has not initiated any new project on cost plus mode. And both of the organizations, because PPIB is dealing with the conventional projects and we are dealing with the renewable projects, we have the directions from the government that, now onwards we are going to move in a planned manner, and IGCEP is the master plan that everybody has to follow. Although, as some of the panels mentioned, that there are concerns that IGCEP takes into account a lot of committed projects, and there is a discussion being going on that what should be the definition of committed projects, whether it be projects that have already achieved financial close, or the projects who have been issued the LOS. Some milestone has to be set, and accordingly those projects have to be dealt. But apart from the committed projects, the IGCEP will take into account new procurements on the basis of least cost. And for sure, wind and solar, as Oliver also mentioned, wind and solar are the most cheapest options we have at the moment. So apart from the committed projects, and apart from some share of nuclear, wind and solar will take the lead. And as Amin Saab also mentioned, that this is the first document, IGCEP, that is going to be finalized and approved by NEPRA, and it is going to be a continuous process. And in fact, in our comments to NEPRA, we have recommended that there was a suggestion by probably NTDC that the revision of IGCEP should be carried out every 5 years. We are facing the dilemma of surplus capacity, and that is the reason why the government is very cautious in adding new power generation capacity, so that we don't end up paying more, adding more to the circular debt. Talking about the 104 projects listed in category 3, that process, we are just waiting for the quantum to be given through the IGCEP. We have already prepared the RFP documents. We took some time, then NEPRA took some time to approve those documents, but now the RFP documents are approved, and we just want to plug in the number, the quantum of megawatts for which we have to carry out the competitive bidding, and we'll be ready with the competitive bidding process for the initially with the for these category 3 depending on the quantum that comes out of the revised final version of the IGCEP. Maybe in parallel we'll also start the implementation of the new policy, and the competitive bidding under the new policy would also be initiated in parallel. If anyone has any questions, I'll be happy to answer those questions.
Thank you so much, Officer, for your intervention, and again, thank you for bringing forward the opinion of AETP with regards to these questions as well. Because again, we've been asked a lot of times what will become of those 104 Category 3 projects, and why are these delays in Pakistan happening, and what if the IGCEP document, if the current version is approved, we won't be seeing any wind for at least not a lot of growth till 2030. So will we have to wait once all the projects that are mentioned as compulsory to go through, will they first go through, and then we'll wait for competitive bidding to start somewhere around the later part of the decade? So these are some concerns that are being raised by a lot of private developers, and we are also faced with these questions that require some answers from the government institutions as well. So thank you for highlighting and raising those concerns and answering some questions as well. Thank you. The next panelist that I would like to move on to is Mr. Simon Nicholas. Mr. Simon Nicholas is working as an energy finance analyst with AIFA, which is the Institute for Energy Economics and Financial Analysis. Simon is also a fellow of the Institute of Chartered Accountants of England and Wales. He joined AIFA in July 2016 after 16 years of experience within the finance industry at ABN AMRO, Macquarie Group, and Commonwealth Bank of Australia in both Sydney and London. Thank you, Simon, for joining us today. So Simon, again, I know that you frequently write about the Pakistani energy market, and you also have a keen understanding of the energy market in Pakistan as well. Some of the attributes often assigned to the renewable energy in Pakistan is that it's unreliable, it's inflexible, and these are some of the biggest hurdles to a higher penetration for solar and wind energy in the country. I know you're from Australia, and South Australia seems to have resolved both of these issues, as we saw that almost 60% of the state's power consumption in 2020 came from solar and wind. So could you please tell how this happened? What are some of the lessons that Pakistan could take from this? What should be the way forward for Pakistan for greater RE integration? And what are your comments about the unreliability and inflexibility of RE?
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much. And thanks for having me on this webinar. So I would sort of start off immediately by saying that renewable energy is not inflexible or unreliable. And South Australia represents a very good case study of this. There's a number of lessons to be learned from South Australia's renewable energy leadership, and I'll try and cover a few of those. We won't have time to go into all of them. I think the first one worth noting is just how fast the transition to renewables can happen once targets are set and appropriate policies are put in place and then left in place without any fiddling around or tinkering or changing them. So back in 2006, which wasn't that long ago, all of South Australia's power generation came from fossil fuels. And then the South Australian state government introduced an initial target of 26% renewable energy generation by 2020. So not renewable energy capacity, but actual generation. And that was perceived to be a very ambitious target at the time. However, South Australia has completely blown past that target. The target was 26%. Actually, last year in 2020, they reached 60% renewable generation, which shows just how fast things can change once the ball is rolling. Another key lesson that South Australia has demonstrated is that the concept of baseload power is now completely outdated. So South Australia no longer has any coal-fired power. The last coal-fired power generation was phased out in 2016. And the state has clearly demonstrated that the historical concept of coal baseload is not required for a reliable power system. And that's a key point. Coal-fired power is also an inflexible power source. It's probably been significantly easier for South Australia to integrate high levels of wind and solar without it. And we're also seeing baseload gas-fired power is now being progressively shut down as more wind and solar come online in South Australia. Gas peaking plants remain in South Australia, but they're on course to be replaced by batteries and pumped hydro storage in the coming years. So today, the South Australian grid is dominated by wind and solar, particularly wind, but solar is catching up fast. And that's backed up increasingly by battery storage, some peaking gas-fired power plants, as I noted, and also an increasing interstate grid connectivity, which I'll touch on further in a moment. Worth noting, there is no large hydropower stations in South Australia. So I know that Oliver at the World Bank noted that hydro is potentially very helpful in Pakistan for supporting higher levels of renewable energy penetration, but that was not an option for South Australia, but it has not impacted reliability. Rooftop solar, it's worth noting it has been a key part of South Australia's success. 40% of all homes in South Australia have rooftop solar, making it one of the global leaders. And last year, 13% of grid demand was provided by rooftop solar. So the state is now expected to achieve its 100% net renewable energy target by 2025. That's 5 years ahead of schedule. The schedule calls for that target to be met by 2030. It's expected they'll achieve that significantly sooner. And then after that, the South Australian government is then aiming to reach 500% renewables by 2050 and to become a renewable energy superpower and exporting surplus renewable energy to other states in Australia and also internationally through green hydrogen and other low emissions products. So this plan is driving new investments, creating new jobs, and driving economic growth in the state. And that's another key lesson, is that South Australia's renewable energy drive is powering jobs and economic growth. And then perhaps the fourth lesson I should touch on is that transmission links are key to enable high levels of renewables. So at present, South Australia's electricity grid is connected only with one other state in Australia, that's Victoria, the state of Victoria, through 2 transmission links. And that enables South Australia to export cheap renewable energy to Victoria and import energy back from Victoria when needed to give that flexibility. But earlier this year, a $2 billion transmission link between South Australia and the state of New South Wales was granted final approval. And it's expected that that will unlock a further 1,800 megawatts of new renewable energy generation and create over 2,600 jobs in the region. And that new transmission link will unlock further energy supply and demand balancing capabilities between South Australia and New South Wales, which will be a benefit to both states and will just further enhance grid security. The fifth lesson that I will make is that this reliance on renewables has not been expensive, it's actually been cheap. So the initial fast uptake of renewable energy in South Australia was driven by market features, including the strong wind and solar resources that South Australia has in common with Pakistan, but also historically high residential and wholesale electricity prices in the state. So South Australia has historically had the highest wholesale power prices in Australia, but we've seen that now change dramatically. Wholesale electricity prices have dropped 65% in South Australia between 2017 and 2021, thanks to the high penetration of cheap renewable energy. I could make several other, or sort of name several other lessons from South Australia's success. So I'll just skip to the last one. The final lesson is that South Australia's success has come in the context of years of federal government indifference and opposition to renewable energy. Whereas on the other hand, the state government support for renewable energy has remained strong in South Australia, even through government changes between political parties. So along with that state government support, it's been the declining cost of wind, solar and battery storage relative to fossil fuel-based power generation, which has allowed South Australia to lead the world in renewables penetration, despite that federal government indifference. That just means that it's happened in South Australia, and we're going to be continuing to see that rollout of cheap wind and solar around the world, and it's just completely unstoppable. And I think I better leave it there, given the time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Simon. Again, pretty similar markets, both South Australia and Pakistan, given the coal aspect as well, and given the fact that we both have exceptional VRE resources as well. So again, there are a lot of lessons to learn, particularly with regards to the deployment of rooftop solar as well. So that kind of gives us a good segue to the next panelist as well. We are also joined today by Ms. Naila Saleh, who's working as an energy economist with the Rural Development Policy Institute. She's also a PhD researcher at Technical University of Berlin. Most of her work is focused on socio-technical transition, energy justice, and climate prediction. I also know that Ms. Saleh is a very keen proponent of distributed generation and off-grid electrification. So my question would be relating to that as well. Again, your research has frequently indicated that distributed generation will have to play a very crucial role in meeting Pakistan's targets for renewable energy. So what kind of institutional challenges and changes are required to accelerate distributed generation growth in Pakistan, and how do you see distributed generation playing out in the future, particularly with regards to grid planning as well? So over to you.
Well, thank you so much, Mustafa. I also have some internet connection issues, so I hope you will tell me if my voice is breaking so that I could change my connection. But you see, I have prepared 3 slides. Could I share my presentation?
Sure, if you want to share your screen.
Okay, sure. I will be quick with it. Well, somebody has to enable the settings.
I can share your screen and
Okay,
then
perfect.
I can share your presentation.
So just to begin, I would say that within the VRE transition debate, which is a very broad area, disruptive technologies and decentralized energy solutions often do not receive the attention that they deserve. And for a country like Pakistan, bottom-up energy transition offers a very fertile space for leapfrogging solar and wind, yet it remains an overlooked discourse in our planning initiatives. So just to put some context, Pakistan is the fourth largest excess deficit country, and a large section of population has not yet been served. And then we have the aligned problem of underserved regions, where in the zones, we call it high non-compliant regions or high loss feeders, where the technical or non-technical efficiencies are quite high. People, despite surplus energy, people are still facing more than 16 hours of load shedding on daily basis. But as I earlier mentioned, that there is no central level attention toward distributed generation. What we are presently witnessing is a very uneven geographic uptake of distributed generation. And if you look at this map, this shows the distributed generation uptake till December 2020 across the utilities. And then I have also tried to map out the transmission and distribution losses, both technical and non-technical, in each utility. So currently, three utilities, ISCO, LESCO, and KEL, they are driving the distributed generation growth. More than 85% of PG is concentrated in these three utilities. And those utilities where the distribution losses are quite high and which make a very compatible case for DG solar, they have barely embraced it. For instance, if you look at KESCO, the technical losses are 23.6%, and the non-technical losses, that is the bill payment that are received by KESCO, are only 24.4%. So if you could, Mustafa, if you could move the next slide. And then again, it has some other inherent favorable characteristics which align with the case situation of Pakistan. For instance, our peak hours, electricity consumption peak hours, range from 2 p.m. to 7 p.m. This is exactly when the solar would be generating significant amount of output and will be reducing the load on the network while saving potential money, displacing the need for peaking generators. Again, we have extensively studied this area, and interestingly, what we have explored in our study, that 44% of the DG systems are presently supported by battery backups, because people are installing these systems due to load shedding. So centralized batteries are quite expensive at this stage, and Pakistan can harness the benefits of distributed storages and have some additional flexibility in the system. And one important point, presently, the two major financial sustainability challenges facing the power sector of Pakistan are the ballooning capacity charges and the distribution losses. And both these problems could be effectively addressed if DG is promoted or diffused. If you are consuming energy near your generation port, this automatically reduces the distribution losses. So for high loss feeders in Pakistan, this builds a very potential case. But if you look at IGCEP, if you could move to the next slide. So IGCEP has largely overlooked distributed generation, and this is really unfortunate. So I would just conclude my presentation here, and I would say that based on this context, we will have to realistically analyze whether the existing traditional energy supply model is compatible with our unique case situation, and to what extent we need to optimize alternative business model paradigms such as commercialization of rooftop solar and on-site generation. Several innovative context-based models could be brainstormed and integrated in the plans, which are more compatible with our unique circumstances and could constructively fulfill the objectives of the rigorous exercise carried out under IGCEP. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Saleh, for your presentation and for, again, highlighting the very important avenue of distributed generation. We still have a lot of population in Pakistan that haven't been served electricity. It's estimated between 20 to 30%. And again, it's a big market for renewable energy as well, and something that needs to be incorporated in our planning as well. So thank you for highlighting that. Thank you.